So welcome, everyone. This is the 21st of February. 21st of February, 2009. And this is a teleconference on Catholic Guide Lecture 84, which is Love, Power, and Serenity as divine attributes and as distortions. And this is part of a series of lectures, not in numerical sequence, but sprinkled throughout a certain segment of the lectures, which you remember were given over a very long period of time, 24, 25 years. The guide would speak every 2 weeks or a month, and they would transcribe the lectures. So this is a very, very long time period. For instance, even from lecture 43, which is the first time reason, will, and emotion were raised as personality types, to 84 was a significant period of time. This was given in 1961. And before that, in lecture 30, the original triad was begun to be discussed. So in the charts and the paperwork that I put out on the website, I've left the material from the previous teleconference on reason, will, and emotion, and it has a bunch of charts in it. And charts are useful because what we're trying to do is discern and delineate between some very, very subtle drifts in personality and distortions. And so it helps to see it from different angles. So in this lecture, Love, Power, and Serenity, the guide first starts out talking about the fact that they are divine attributes. So there's nothing inherently wrong with love, power, and serenity. And the lecture does not dwell too long on the wonderful divine qualities of these attributes. It begins to talk immediately about where they go into distortion. And what the guide describes is that the dilemma becomes not each individual attribute at any particular time, but a place where the sorry, I just got stuck. There's a piece of equipment that just malfunctioned. If you'll excuse me for just 1 second.
There we go. We'll start back up a second. So the problem with, or the reason that we're focusing on love, power, and serenity as divine attributes in their distortion is because when these attributes are well balanced, okay, when the attributes alternate back and forth freely with each other, depending on where they are called forward and where they are used in their divine perfection, this is where they shine. But when they are in distorted state, what they do is they begin to mutually exclude each other. In effect, we begin to use or value one attribute to the expense of another. Okay? So they complement and strengthen each other is what the lecture says, and a flexibility is maintained so that none of these three attributes can ever contradict or interfere with each other until we weight one as having more value or being better, or we begin to use the attribute instead of exhibiting the attribute. So that's the place where these divine attributes fall into distortion. So the guide spends 3 or 4 pages at the beginning talking about the particular divine attribute of love when love turns into submission. And he says that he does that because sometimes it's harder to see that as a distortion than it is for the other two in their distortions. So in terms of love, it's not the giving and receiving, the generous giving and receiving of love that obviously goes into distortion. It's a place where a must comes into this, where instead of being enthusiastic and in the moment and having eros for loving and being loved, what happens is that we feel that our self-worth has become attached to whether we give or receive love. Now, between those two, it's a little easier to see where people have a forcing current behind giving love, because that's exhibiting some aggression. That's not just submission, that's actually some aggression involved with that, where we insist that you receive our love. Where these attributes are a little sneakier and where they are perhaps a little harder to find is in submission. So I noticed that a fair amount of this lecture focused on the quality of love in terms of submission, specifically because it is not easy to detect the pride that can be attached to that. So the pride begins to exhibit itself in the fact that the person who is trying to receive love feels that they must, of course, be of a certain caliber to deserve to receive love. So they begin to emphasize areas of their personality that deserve love. And they naturally would de-emphasize, that's the beginning, very sneaky, very small, very cute. We de-emphasize just a little bit the places in us that aren't quite so lovable. So that's like the place where you first step off the beaten track. And then it begins to escalate. Because what happens when you must receive love is that you begin to imagine what kind of person you need to be to receive love. And that begins to snowball into an idealized self-image. Now, the idealized self-image we talked about a few teleconferences ago. And the dilemma with the idealized self-image is that it's frozen. It's not a real person with flaws and acne and who muffs their words and is selfish sometimes but unselfish more often than not. The idealized self-image sets a bar so high that no real person can meet it. So when we feel like we must receive love and we must be the kind of person who deserves love, then we're headed on our way to inventing an idealized self-image that we will need to meet that does not reflect our real self. Now, the lecture goes on to say that as a natural course of events, what happens is that when we're not allowed to be real, we actually deep down inside us react to that. So nobody really wants to be a plastic caricature of themselves. And so what happens is that we begin to resent the persona that we have to wear. And we begin to be angry at not being free, at not being creative, at not being spontaneous, but always having to be unselfish and loving and kind and wonderful and all these attributes that we've built up in our idealized self-image. So besides the fact that we can't be real, we can't be the full spectrum of who we are, which could be 99% good, 98%, but we've decided that those 2%, if somebody saw them, might make us unlovable. So once we inhabit that and become attached to it, then what enters in is the pride in being so good. So that God proposes that it's goodness, it's holiness, and unselfishness becomes the marker that we have to meet. And in the pride that develops from that tends to have a sense of contempt for any other human action that isn't of that caliber for two reasons. One is that we've decided what's good and bad, so there's a line drawn in the sand. But secondly, when others exhibit glitches, when they burp, when they do a cosmic fart, we see in that moment perhaps a bit of who we are. And there's a judgment of them that is actually a judgment of our real self. So in other words, we're trying to mask who we really are. We're trying to erase all the bad bits. And when someone else displays it, there's almost a sense of, why do you get to be real when I don't? And secondly, a reminder that we're like that too. So for all these distortions that we talk about, we know what is real. I think that more people have a sense of truth than perhaps are willing to admit it. We don't want to be arrogant, we don't want to act like we know everything, and we don't want to judge other people. And yet, there's a place where we know the truth when we hear it. And we know when something's not right when we hear it. And when I work with people, one of the things I count on is that they know. There's an innate part of them that really wants to be whoever they are, and who is tired of the game and the charade. And that's why when this work is done, the reason it's not just therapy trying to fix twitches and dilemmas and piece things back together, the reason it's spiritual work is part of our work is to activate, to reach and to activate and stimulate the divine qualities in people, their real self. Bring in their higher self energies, bring in their positive intention, bring in that little piece that says, I don't think this is right. I don't know quite what it is, but this isn't right. Now, you could be wrong. Maybe that is right. But it's in the exploration that we can find this out. And a fear of exploring is not conducive to your finding the truth. So to support people in finding the truth, in trying to help them not be afraid of who they really, really are, it's very useful to bring forward or to coax forward or to invite the higher self positive intention. It's kind of the equivalent of turning yourself in. What we do when we go on a spiritual journey looking for the truth is we have begun the process of believing that the truth would be of more value than the white lies or the illusions that we have been living under. It's a very, very powerful process. And it may take a long time or a lot of effort, but that's the journey, so there we are. So in looking at submissiveness, oops, somebody leaned on their key there. In looking at submissiveness, okay, there's a lot of truth in love. And there's truth in compromise. There's truth in bending a little bit to be with other people, in not making demands that it be your way, in trying to understand how other people see the world. But we're talking about going just a tad further than that. We're talking about submitting to their views about what is good, rather than standing up for ours. Now, I don't submit a lot now in my life. So when I look at my own life, I find a lot of submission, but it's not, the huge bits aren't as recent, perhaps, as for other people. And people laugh because they say, you're kidding. And I say, no, I submitted. I submitted a lot in my life. It's a lesson that I learned. And it took me, let's give it 3, maybe 4 decades to learn that you can't buy love. And I learned that by trying. And that's what we do. So from a spiritual perspective, we're looking at a very, very long timeline here. You don't have to get this by the time you're 7.5 years old. You don't have to get this by the time you're 22. These lessons are life lessons. And the invitation in the lectures is to take all the time you need, to go as fast or as slow as you are prompted to do, and to find your way through the examination of your life and your values at your own pace. Now, for instance, in reading the lecture, I always get surprised. It's embarrassing sometimes because you're teaching a lecture and you know the lecture and you read it and go, wow, I didn't remember that part. In the questions and answers at the back, their guide says over and over again something that can be infuriating, and that is you cannot generalize. And people naturally are looking for clear delineations. It's useful. It's not that we want to be boxed, but we have a tendency that if we have this and that clearly delineated, it's easier to see. But the guide, when asked certain questions, kept saying over and over again, you cannot generalize about this work. It is unique to each individual. And what I'm inviting you to see in that, there's frustration. He's not giving me an answer. He's not giving me pointers. You know, if you just tell me what to fix, I'd fix it. Okay? But that's not really what the work is. What the work is to find it. And part of the value of this kind of spiritual transformative work is to see how long it took you to find it. That might seem backwards to some people, but if you are looking at a part of you that is in distortion so tight and you're so blind that it takes you 20 years to see it, I invite you to see what a victory that is when you finally see it. So in the process of looking at lectures, if you're inspired to look at it, if you're inspired to say, oh, this lecture is really, really interesting, the learning of a lecture, the learning of a concept, or the learning of your own distortions is a little bit like an artichoke. And I remember the first time I saw an artichoke. I don't consider myself dumb or unsophisticated, but it just so happens that I never saw one before until I was 18 years old. And it was put on my plate at a family dinner with some people I knew, and it doesn't look edible. If you don't have experience with an artichoke, it can be a little mystifying. And not realizing how gauche I could be with food, it never occurred to me, I knew so little bit about food, I kept looking for the part you eat. And I kept peeling the leaves off and pulling them off and pulling them aside until I got down to the heart. And of course the heart is full of very, very tiny, disgusting, irritating hairs that you don't want to eat. And that is when I finally looked up to see the entire table looking at me. Absolutely aghast, because I thought I was a normal, reasonable person who knew foodstuffs. And not wanting to laugh at me because they were kind people. But there I was with this artichoke spread all over my plate looking for the part to eat because I didn't recognize what you ate in an artichoke, even when you got down to the heart of it. So the game is not about how many leaves can I tear off my personality until I get to the good stuff or resolve it. The game is not what do I cast off. And I use the word game because it is a bit of a game. From a divine perspective, we're here because we're full of positive intention and we have a goal and we have a task and we're here with zest and enthusiasm and energy. The idea is not to cast off all these bits that don't seem to make sense, but to consider what they're doing there. Why was this structure put together in the first place? From a divine perspective, who are you? What were you trying to find? That your personality with all its distortions is a little bit like a treasure map. And you can find interesting things out about yourself as a spirit if you treat these layers of distortion with respect. And of course that doesn't mean that you don't try to work with them. But instead of casting them off. Isn't that interesting? So isn't it interesting that it took me 30 or 40 years to stop submitting? When once you do that, you realize how silly and useless and distorted it was and how it didn't work, and you realize all these things. But that's like those 3D pictures that you look on the wall, and you look at them and you cock your head to one side and you unfocus, and people are trying to help and they say stand back another foot, and then wow, you get it. All of a sudden it's right there in front of you. And once you get it, you don't forget. You can get it in an instant. You can go by that picture and pick up what it's about. But that moment of just not knowing what you're looking at and not realizing where the outlines of the object are and just dealing with all these fuzzy bits that make no sense to you, that's where we start from when we look at personality. That's where we start from when we look at spirituality. So again, the guide talks about the divine, how love can turn into a distortion. Partly, I believe, because it's sneaky how it does that. And love and distortion can create a person who seems to work unselfishly and wholeheartedly for common goals. And so society supports that. There's a big yay for people who support other people's efforts, who give and give unselfishly, who are always there, who are always willing, who always have a smile on their face and are cheering up everybody else. And the part of that that is honest and true, that's not the problem. But what happens if you're grumpy and you don't want to do something one day? If in your idealized self-image you either don't believe that saying no is appropriate, or if you feel that you are actually trying to earn love and the day you don't show up, people might think badly of you, then showing up is not honest. It's not really who you are. It's a submission to the values of others, to the needs of others at your expense, and to the tyranny of your own idealized self-image that you have built up. Now I can think of another example. I was going to a play one time. My daughter was in a play, and I asked a friend to join us because we had to travel a ways, and I thought that'd be nice, they could come with us. And they said, well, what's the topic of the play? And it was some Norwegian thing. I'm really sorry, I can't remember, but you know, it's not Stravinsky, but you get the idea. Some classic play about suicide. And my friend said, no thank you. I'm really not in a place where I want to spend the evening watching a play about suicide. And I remember being absolutely aghast, because to me that had nothing to do with it. I was going to support my daughter, and I thought my friend would want to support me and my daughter, and the subject of the play wasn't even in my thinking. And I was angry at my friend. And it took perhaps a week or a week and a half where it started to dawn on me that this person was showing self-care for themselves. What they were saying is, I love you, I love your daughter, I would be happy to support you, but I really can't be there 100% for you today. So perhaps I'll choose another time or another place where I can be wholeheartedly in support. But this time I would be in mask. And the truth is, at that time in my life, I was living so much in mask, I thought that was normal. Why don't you be in mask? And that's what this distortion of love can create. A place where we're living in a mask so long and so often that we don't know what mask is. So it can be kind of fun when you first do this work, because there's like archaeology, there's the you use the big shovels for a while, and that gets the energy going, and it's a lot of fun, and you get a lot of things done. And then you use the smaller shovels, and then you get down to the trowels. And after a while with this work, you're sitting there with the tweezers, sifting through the little tiny shards of tissue paper, trying to find things. So when we look for mask and distortion, these can be big layers of our personality. But again, we're not trying to rip them off or throw them away. What we're trying to find out is this real? And there's a phrase, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I picked up some trivia about what that meant. And I think it's kind of cute and perhaps apropos here. In the old days, you know, those good old days where everybody was happy and everything worked right, you only took a bath once a week or once a month. And when you had a family of 10 children and several adults, the rule was that the head of the household got the hot water first, and then it went down the line through all the kids until the last person who was bathed was the baby. Now, I find it amusing, the idea of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the bathwater at that point is pretty murky. And the idea of not being able to find the baby in the bathwater and emptying the tub. Anyway, sorry, that's my cockeyed sense of humor. But I think it's apropos here in this. You're not trying to throw away love. You're not trying to throw away submission as a reality that occurs when people try to get along with each other. What this lecture is about is when the natural alternation of taking care of me, taking care of you, when that natural ebb and flow like the tide doesn't just come in and out, when we try to dam it up and make it only happen one way, that's when we go into distortion. There's another lecture, forget the number, called The Anatomy of Contraction. It talks about the same thing, that there's a cycle to life. There's a breathing in and a breathing out, and there's a pause. And everybody pauses someplace in the breathing cycle. It's just not natural to not pause or hesitate. Some people pause at the intake, and some people pause at the bottom of the breath. There's no right or wrong about this. You pause where you pause. Some people pause in 2 places. Some people pause for a long time. So there's an exercise that is done sometimes where you copy the breathing of another person. And it is a fascinating exercise because it takes so little time and so little effort. And it tells you so much about how individual we are. And if you know somebody and you want to try it, it takes 2 minutes. And what you do is you copy the breathing of the other person. They breathe normally, and you watch them, and you take your breath exactly at their pace, pausing wherever they pause, and letting the breath out. And in this class that I was in, it was startling because we found it very painful and difficult to copy somebody else's breathing pattern. Number 1, it wasn't normal. Number 2, some of us breathe in quickly and take our time letting out. And it was difficult for us to push air out and take a long time letting the air in. For something as simple as breath, we are highly individualistic. So when you get a bunch of people in a room together and they're all doing something at the same time, you're going to need to compromise at some point. You're going to need to figure a rhythm, like a tidal flow, between what you want and what I want. And again, this goes into distortion only when there's an artificiality in the natural flow. So in terms of pride, in this particular distortion of love, in terms of submissiveness, the guide says, so he feels proud of his self-sacrificing martyrdom, superior in spiritual development or ethical standards. pride, hypocrisy, and pretense are present in all the attitudes, love, power, and serenity, when incorporated in the idealized self-image. But the submissive type will have a harder time finding the pride, while the aggressive type will have a harder time finding the pretense. So then the lecture goes on. Any questions at this point? Okay. So then, at that point, the lecture goes on. He talks about the second category being the seeker for power. Okay. So,
it's Wendy here.
Yes, Wendy.
Can I just interrupt?
Sure.
Something came up just in the last couple of days where my sister-in-law and brother-in-law wanted something of ours at a value that was less than what it was worth. And they called me selfish for saying no. But I discussed it with Barry afterwards, and he was saying something like, oh, it's only a little bit. And I said, if I gave that to them, I would resent them. And it was a real eye-opener to feel, I mean, I've obviously been submissive a lot before, but that resentment,
wow.
An eye-opener. Yeah.
That's a beautiful realization. Because as small as it may be, what I hear in your voice and in your saying it is you realize that that wouldn't go away the next day.
Yeah.
So imagine, it's like a grain of sand in your eye. It could be fairly small, but it can irritate you. It can actually ruin a relationship. So that's a very powerful observation. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you.
So anyone else? I pause sometimes to give you space, but not to put pressure on you. But if anybody wants to add anything, they're certainly welcome to do it. Okay. So we'll go on.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is Leah.
Yes, ma'am.
You made a distinction between in a submissive personality type of behavior, it's hard to find, and I lost that part, versus the aggressive type where it's hard to find the pretense.
Okay. For the submissive type, it is hard to find the pride. In other words, what I hear the guide saying is that because the submissive type is hiding behind a cloak of goodness, they may see that as submission and not realizing that they're pushing a certain value system, that they have decided a certain value system is better. It's like you're underneath it with your shoulder, shoving it upwards, and you think of yourself as working very hard. You think of yourself as supporting something wonderful. But you're not seeing the larger picture. You're not seeing where you can be enforcing something onto other people. And you enforce it with an inherent, but that's good. So this is where, I know you've seen the charts, where it lists spiritual pride. Spiritual pride is one of the distortions, one of the defenses of the emotion type. Does that help?
Yeah, just the distinction was interesting. I have not put them next to each other in that kind of way. So, thank you.
Yeah, I once again, I sometimes laugh because I need to read these lectures way ahead of time so I don't get surprised an hour before the teleconference. Because as I was reading this, I noticed how the guide marries, if we talk about reason, will, and emotion, he marries the emotion and will distortions, and then he marries the reason and will distortions. And that, of course, has some truth to it. And the reason why it has truth is that everybody's a will type. We all exercise will. We all have some form of push bringing us forward into this world. So there are no pure absolute reason types, and there are no pure absolute emotion types. So you get, in effect, a rainbow spectrum. And if it isn't a rainbow, it's from, you know, this is probably a bad analogy, but if you go from black to white, it's all gray. Except for the ends, for which there is no absolute in human nature. You're just talking about shades of gray. Are you more in the black or dark gray? Are you more in the white or light gray? And so when the guide talks about the nuances of this, he very commonly talks about that little bit of will holding up the distortions of the emotion type. And that's where it becomes prideful instead of a simple mask. So the emotion type is not devoid of will. But they may, in a weak way, want the goodness of their position to substitute for their own self-responsibility in putting forward what they believe is right. So in other words, we hide under goodness that is universally accepted because we don't want to put out what we think is good because we could get into arguments with other people. So that's where the somebody who's way over on the one end of the spectrum with emotion will use their will to pull in extra. The words that are coming to me is combative power. That's not the right words, but they'll try to bring in some enforcement, some force to help support them in what they actually want. Some validation. Now, in the last teleconference, we talked about the 3 principles of evil. And in that lecture, the emotion type would be using, once again, nobody's a type, but it's a way of discussing things. The emotion type would use half-truth. So the emotion type would use reason, but without respect for it, to try to bolster what they want. And the reason type would utilize proof to bolster what they actually want. It's in that little bolstering that we see the will in both types. Okay. So a sheer emotion type who simply believed that connection was the best thing would just wander the street looking for connection and just accept whatever connection was given to them. But very few of us are like that. And if we saw somebody like that, we'd probably think they were unhinged. So this is where in the lecture, the guide is talking about a spectrum, and it's like a fulcrum. And it goes back and forth from reason to emotion, and will is the force that pushes it back and forth. So remembering that a will type might utilize both ends of the spectrum. In other words, a true will type is balancing back and forth, trying to find an advantage. Whereas some of us lean towards one side naturally, and others lean to the other side. So there is no type, and it says, there's a quote in the lecture, but I can't find it right now, that basically says, we all have little bits and pieces of everything. Nobody's devoid of these qualities. So the question becomes, well, why would I study it? And the answer would be, you study what interests you, and you study what is active in your life in a distorted fashion. So that's how you would select which lecture or which concept that you might want to work with, because you resonated with it. And it's that resonance that I'm talking about when I talk about we know. In our gut, we know this lecture is talking about us. If this is the lecture we're attracted to. We know there's something here we need. We may not know what it is, and it could take years to really understand what it is, but that's not the point. You need to start someplace, and it is that bit of intuition that leads you to read something or to focus on it, or to remember a quote for years on end. So when the guide moves into the second category, talking about the seeker for power, Okay? Remembering that with reason, will, and emotion, the emotion type is most afraid of lack of connection. That's their idea of purgatory, of hell. And for the will type, their idea of the worst thing that could possibly happen would be to be helpless. So naturally, the attribute that they would want to activate would be power. Because if I have and use power, then I can prevent this thing that I am afraid of. But power alone, a will type just doesn't sit here saying, I have power and I will use it when it's appropriate. Because if they do that, that's not a distortion. And what we're talking about here is a place where somebody has power and wants to activate it either just in case or because they really feel that helplessness is a current threat. So the person with a power drive will try to compete and try to be better than everyone else. So again, I'm sure that all of you have stories about times and places where perhaps you were the equivalent of coming in last. And if there was going to be a decision made that there are 10 people in the room and the first 5 people who finish will go on to something else and the second 5 will not go on, then naturally we would try very hard to finish in the first 5. It's human nature. And that activates our natural competitiveness. But it is most powerful to anyone who fears being helpless. And part of helpless would be being left out, because once you're out, you have no power in that arrangement. So everyone might hurry up a little bit, or watch each other, or watch the clock, and everybody who's left behind might feel really bad. But in distortion, what we're talking about here is a person with a power drive who simply cannot afford to lose. We have to be included. We have to win. We have to be far enough away from that cutoff point to feel safe. So what the guide says here is that the pride in the image of the power drive is very honest. But the dishonesty is not. And the dishonesty is the fact that the person with a power drive tends to restrict anything that would seem to get in their way, such as feelings, such as contradictory situations. A person with a power drive would falsely clarify a situation so that they could move forward. Because a little bit of chaos or I'm not sure means they can't drive through a situation. And when you clarify something, or you say you over here and you over there, when there's no particular reason to do that except your own fear, this is hypocrisy. This is pretense. This is the power mask. And the power mask says this has to be done now. The aggression is called for. Because they're not open to the possibility of not using their power. And they're not open to it because they're afraid. They see things in terms of win-lose, and if they're open, they might have to accept losing. And a real power type can't accept losing unless they reimagine it into winning. So the human mind being creative, we can do a lot of things that look like losing to one person. We've convinced ourselves that, no, that's not losing, that's really winning. And we partly do that to save face. And so we can go into something enthusiastically instead of feeling like we're going to fall over a cliff. So this is where risky behavior and doing things that other people think are foolhardy, that's all in the mind of the person involved. For someone else, they might see that taking the chance is the best opportunity they've got. And what they're saying is, I'm willing to take risks. Because if I win, that really will be good for everybody. And the mask part of that would be that it would make them stronger. It would give them more power. And like the emotion type, it would give them more power because people like and respect winners. And this is the kind of pride that the power type has, that holds a pretense. So they're not submitting as much to public opinion as they are in trying to create public opinion so that they can design their own future, so that they can feel safe. But can you feel the fear that is still driving power when it is in distortion? Now, I've had lots of discussions for lots of years with people because I tend to be a little aggressive. And there's a tendency sometimes in spiritual work to tamp down aggression and to look at softer aspects of personality. And I'm exaggerating, of course, but I sometimes feel like a bull in a china shop. And so I've become somewhat experienced at looking at my own motives, because I agree that sometimes that's about feeling safe and being in charge and getting my way. That, hands down, sometimes I'm guilty. But there are other occasions where aggression is and can be a positive force. And I hold a space, I like to hold a space where, as I said before, with the submissive, with the love defense of submissiveness, compromise is called for sometimes. Even bad compromise is called for sometimes. We need to get along, we need to work together. Can't always agree. Sometimes power and aggression is called for. Even the guide says that wars on this planet are an unfortunate reality, and they won't go away soon. They will go away. We can do something about it. But sometimes you need to go to war as human beings when wrong is being done, when negative aggression is hurting people, when there's something at stake that is of value. You may need to go to war. The trick is to keep that in as much as you can, leashed into positive aggression, rather than revenge or retribution, or to fall into the trap of your side, my side, God's on my side, you're wrong, and make that a moral judgment. So again, positive aggression per se, what I should say is aggression per se is neutral. So when you look at any one aspect, this goes back to what the guide says about you cannot generalize. You cannot say that X is wrong inherently. You need to look at X. You need to look at the situation. You need to look at context. How did it get there? What track is it on? Is it in the process of becoming seen and heard? Then it's a good thing that it comes to the surface. So that's a little bit about the power type. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take a brief break. I have to change 2 tapes. So I'm going to stop for a second and then pick up again. One moment. Yes?
A question?
Sure. I'm going to say real quick, this is side 2 or part 2 of Love, Power, and Serenity, lecture 84. Go ahead.
When you say that the power type or the will type is afraid of being helpless, that really resonates with me, and I can see the fear and the terror of that feeling helpless. So when I think of hopelessness, I think that's a very negative way or negative. What would be the positive or the divine side of being helpless?
Okay, great question. what I really do is I play with this. And because I am an aggressive type, I tend to talk, and I sometimes don't listen for other contributions, so sometimes you have to whack me on the head to get your 2 words in. But the positive of helplessness would be to experience vulnerability. Let me describe it this way. There's a place of, we used to call it in class, I don't know why, but my class came up with this example, we used it every year for 8 years, of going through the hoop of fire, of discovering that something that you were afraid of wasn't going to kill you. So helplessness per se isn't an infant helpless. A human infant left on its own has 0 chance for survival. It is totally and completely helpless. And in that state, an infant can learn that it can depend on other people to give it what it needs. Now, I'm talking in the extreme. Of course, we don't get everything we need, and we resent that for the rest of our lives. But if you're speaking on this phone, if you're walking and talking, somebody gave you the basic essentials that human beings need to function. And so when you were at your absolute most helpless stage on this planet, you were not left on your own. And the degree to which we got met during that period, which is infant, obviously infant and child psychology, from a spiritual perspective, that emblazoned us with an attitude around being helpless. So you were asking what the positive of helplessness would be. And that's one example. I'll give you another. I had an experience once on a hike that I'm going to analogize. I did not do basic training. I was never in the military. But because I had an experience on a hike, I extrapolate and I began to have a deep understanding of how military forces create such a strong bond in a fighting group. And by going through the basic training, breaking people down, showing them that they can't climb out of the mud, they can't scale the wall, they can't keep up. They'll always give you a task that is more than you can possibly accomplish. They'll figure out what you can do and assign you 120%. By taking you to the place where you can't do it, and having your team members reach out and help you, is a tremendous bonding process. Now, I learned that on a hike when my electrolytes got out of balance and I started feeling dizzy and I thought I'd have to quit and go back. And somebody said, no, we can help. And I realized that I had never in my life accepted help on a physical level like that since I was an infant. And in accepting their help, and a little humility, because I was a little prideful, and realizing that this hypoglycemic condition would pass, and allowing them to take my backpack, and not running away from the situation, I learned a profound lesson that allowing people to help me, number one, it didn't kill me. Secondly, it didn't make me a baby. Thirdly, people didn't look down on me. That was in my mind. People were glad to help. They enjoyed being able to help me. And these particular people on the hike knew about this situation. They'd seen it before. It wasn't a drama to them. They were really cool with it. It was I had the problem. So those are 2 or 3 examples that I can give you of where becoming helpless can be a place of tremendous learning about yourself and your attitudes, and also about the willingness of others to reach out and give you a hand. So another example is the catastrophes that we've seen in various places on the planet. Yes, we've seen people who normally wake up in the morning and go to work and drive their car and take care of their families, totally devastated, completely and utterly devastated, to the point where they need food and water. And we don't feel high and mighty about getting food and water to them. In fact, it makes us feel good to be able to help other people. So when we talk about being helpless, we're really speaking from a very egocentric perspective. If we come out of that, and remember I talked about the 3 spheres, this would be in the place of the individual self-sphere, where we're only concerned about us and we don't care what the other person's learning. If we come out of that tight little bubble and we see where our helplessness allows other people to reach into the depth of their character and learn something about themselves and learn to bring more love forward for their fellow man, that's where helplessness can become a tremendous positive. Now, does that kind of help you out there on the helpless part? I hope so. Okay. So it's a game that I play, a little bit of a devil's advocate. Whenever I used to, being human, I used to point at other people and say, you don't see the full perspective, so you believe one thing, but I have another point of view, and let me explain to you how both can have validity. And then, of course, one day I realized that perhaps I should use this on my own pet projects and my own beliefs that I hold very dear and have a grip around, a tight, tight fist around my own beliefs. And that's a little harder to allow for the possibility that there's another perspective and that I could be wrong. But it's tremendous spiritual exercise to undergo, to play as devil's advocate with yourself. And this is why in finding our distortions, that's the positive of finding them. How can you fix what you cannot see? So I use another lecture when I teach. I use the lecture 127, which is the 4 stages of evolution. And what that lecture talks about is 4 points. And the first 4 stages. The first stage is automatic reflex. And that means you don't know. If you don't know, you're being mean. You can't do a lot about it. The second stage is awareness. And that's where you become aware that you're being mean. Notice you're still being mean, but awareness begins to come through. And that's what happens when we train children, when we raise children. We're trying to bring to them an awareness of a larger set of needs or a larger set of priorities or a larger world than just, I want my biscuit now. So you have automatic reflex where you don't know what's going on. It means you can't do anything about it. Then you have awareness. And all awareness shows you is that something's not right. It's painful when it's not right, and you don't know what to do about it yet. Then the third stage is understanding. These aren't discrete. There's no hard, thick magic marker line between these stages. They're very, very fluid. And they're not only very fluid, they happen, you can be in different stages in different aspects of your life on this. And the third stage is understanding. And it is in the understanding that we can soften the pain of awareness. Where you can learn, yes, I am being mean, but you know what? I'm not mean all the time. But I am mean in a particular situation, and I'm going to begin the process of understanding why I'm triggered to be mean in a given situation. And the last stage in Lecture 127's 4 stages is knowing. And in the knowing, it's like the psychic nuclear point. In the knowing, we're done. I know I'm mean on occasion. I understand it. I have done things about it. When people bring it to my awareness, I will act immediately on it because I understand completely that it is possible. I have an understanding of where it comes from, and I have an understanding of how to support and counteract this unfortunate tendency of mine to be selfish in a given circumstance. So what I'm reaching for here is that it isn't the inherent issue. It isn't the inherent distortion. It's not who you are or where you came from. It's not where you've been headed or where you've... nothing is inherently positive or negative. And it can all be dealt with. It can all be worked with. It's all material. But in order for you to understand why you're behaving in a certain way, you may need some information. And some of that information goes back to childhood and some of it goes back to yesterday. So the example was given on submitting and selling something to somebody you care about at a lower price. Such a simple little thing. But if you've done it once, you may have done it 20 times, and you may not have caught the other 19. But just because you don't remember the other 19 doesn't mean you're not irritated by them. You cannot intellectually remember 19 other incidents. But emotionally, whenever a situation comes up again, it's like Pavlovian dog stuff. You're programmed to think, this is going to hurt. I'm going to sell myself out. This is going to be unpleasant. This is going to even get worse. In that moment of awareness, and the moment that was described was very luscious, because not only was awareness realized, but there was an understanding. This is not a good thing. This is not a simple thing. This is not a small thing. And giving in on this is not real love. So let's go back to a moment to the distortion of submission. When I give in to you, I'm not being me. And so what am I giving you? I'm giving you a mask. I'm giving you an image. And because I'm a full-blooded human being, there's a part of me that knows that and resents it. So I'm not only not giving you me, I'm setting up an area of resentment in me that could affect our future relationship together. That's not a loving thing to do. Now, if you move over into power, from the position of wanting power so that I won't be helpless, because I've decided helpless is bad and no good will come of it and I will be destroyed. You've got to get that it's not just helpless, it's that other series of attitudes attached to it. So if I give in to you, I become more and more helpless, and I lose ground. And so, lost my point for a second. Happens sometimes. Just comes on me. Let me breathe for a second. So we're talking about how that's not really loving to submit. It's also not loving to try to take care of yourself and your own helplessness under the guise of strength when we say that's for somebody else. That's why I lost it, because it's a little confusing. It's a little kind of, I call them double backflips. So when I exercise power and I say it's for the good of all, and the truth is it's not for the good of all, it's for the good of me, that's also not loving. that doesn't allow me to be me. And if, for instance, I took leadership with that attitude, you would have a leader that you wouldn't really know. So there's a bit of a con job going on there. So these are where these attributes that could be used for good, that could be used neutrally or positively, when they're used negatively, they don't serve the person using them, and they don't serve others. And at some point in this lecture, the guide says, and it's a favorite thing of mine, so I notice when the guide says something I really agree with. What he says is that sometimes it's easier to notice it in others. And when we're studying personality, I believe that it is sometimes easier to notice mask and idealized self-image. It's easier to notice false submissiveness. It's easier to notice where somebody is withdrawing, haven't talked about that yet, where somebody is withdrawing and pulling away simply because they don't want to get hurt, not because it's the appropriate thing to do, but because they don't have the tools to deal with it, and so they want to pull out and pretend it's not happening. So it's easier to see those moments when we're looking at somebody else. And what I teach is, let that be appropriate for you. If you can see it by looking at someone else, great. It's more important to really get a picture of the concept than in the cycle or the order in which you learn it. But the other thing, which comes in again at the end of this lecture, when the guide says you cannot generalize, he's saying that because the situation is always comes down to the individual and their work. So when you learn something about a concept, such as false submission, and you learn it because you see it being enacted by another, that's not the end of the work. This is not an intellectual exercise. The other half of the work is to bring that concept in and to find out in your own self where you submit. And when I went through my notes, I found a place where what it felt like to me was the guide says that the key to learning this is to actually notice a void. So in other words, it's really, really interesting if the guide says that we all have parts of these and we all participate in all these distortions and we all have pieces of will, pieces of emotion, and pieces of reason in terms of personality type. If you cannot see one of these concepts in yourself, this should raise an alarm bell. As long as you can see it a little bit, that may be all there is. It just may not be where you go into distortion very much. But the key is, if you can't see it at all, you may be hiding from yourself. You may not be being honest. So again, it's useful to look outside and see in the great big wide world all these terrible distortions. But finishing up the work involves coming in and saying, where do I submit? Where do I try to power through things because it makes me nervous to saunter? It makes me nervous to walk slowly. I don't know if any of you have ever had to perform in any way where you needed to walk very slowly across a stage to receive a diploma, or in some circumstances where a lot of people are watching you and you're supposed to walk very slowly. And my experience was I can't walk straight. I'm rolling on my feet, and I don't really know how to walk slowly, smoothly, and gracefully. Okay? Well, it's interesting. When you slow yourself down, this is where you can find some of these elements of distortion, because they may hide under we have to take care of it. We have to do it this way. We don't have time to think about this. This is a must. These intellectual justifications and rationalizations that say, don't question it, this is just the way it is. That's a way of moving briskly. But taking it apart and saying, what if we don't? What if we don't do this today? Will the sky fall? When we hear the little voice saying, yes, yes, the sky will fall, that's important. That's an important voice for you to find. Where, if you take off your mask, will you not be loved? Where, if you stop driving through things, will you become helpless? And then we turn to the third distortion, which is withdrawal. And in withdrawal, withdrawal is about not being able to cope with the conflicting needs that go on in terms of being a human being. So the reason type would like there to be order and serenity and tables and graphs and proof, and you know what's true and you know what's false, not because you want to win, you just know where they are. It's the reason type. Okay? Order is what reason types are looking for. Well, human beings are a terrible place to look for order because we are chaotic and things happen irrationally and for no reason. We're a mess. And when reason types try to deal with conflicting human feelings and situations and find that there is no way to resolve it, they might withdraw. And withdrawal is the pseudo-solution to try to create the false mask of serenity. So there's nothing wrong with serenity. Serenity's fabulous if it's true. But false serenity, a pretense that there is order when there is not, is actually a very subtle unplugging from reality. So everybody I know has gone numb sometimes when things get out of control, when there are too many opinions, when there's when very, very important things are happening and they don't have time to research and they just have to make a choice and let it go, and they have this gut feeling that that choice may not be the best choice, but they don't know what to do. It's really, really hard for every single person, and I was coming so close to it, I'm going to try to avoid it, but there's no way to avoid it, so I'm going to move right into this financial situation on the globe is one of those hideously complicated messes. And we as a culture, a global culture and individual nation cultures, we haven't been here before. We've seen similar experiences, but we've never seen it to this magnitude. And so nobody really has a magic bullet. Everybody's guessing. And they're guessing with incredible amounts of money that have zeros that are dizzying. And if at some point you notice that you just don't watch the news, and you just don't read the papers, and you just don't get involved, and you just don't think about it, this could be a very subtle form of withdrawal. May also be good for your mental health. We all need a break sometimes. But I'm not talking, remember in the beginning we were talking about an alternating flow, like the tide flows in and the tide flows out. You breathe in and you breathe out. You read 4 or 5 papers in a row, you watch a certain number of documentaries, you watch the news, and then you say, oh, I need a break. You need to go away for the weekend, you need to take some time off, and then I'll be refreshed and I'll come back and I'll see what I can do, which may not be much. This would be completely different than an artificial withdrawal that basically says, don't understand money, don't want to talk about it. Okay? Because that's not true. Everybody understands money. We may not understand high finance. But when our lives are on the line and our, this is part of our culture, we need to all pitch in and help together, it's important to understand. So what I'm describing is the distortion of withdrawal rather than the ebb and flow and the alternating need to engage, withdraw, and refresh. Engage, withdraw, and refresh. And the reason type who needs order, who sees that order is important for them to function in. This may not be the best example, but some people just can't relax in a messy room. They just can't do it. You put them in a messy room and they pick up the clutter and they may even clean. That's what they do. But this is just a tiny sliver of the reason type, of needing an orderly environment to be able to sweep the room and see where things are, to be able to reliably go and open a drawer and get the pens from that drawer and not have to spend a half an hour running around the house trying to find a ballpoint pen. So everybody has elements of the reason personality type. Everybody has some degree, so everybody has to some degree a need for order. But when order is imposed as a pseudo-solution, as a false solution to a problem, that's when it's gone into distortion. So when you cannot function, you simply cannot function with a fork out of place, time to look at yourself. Okay, because if that level of order puts you off your stride, maybe you're relying too much on a clear counter and not enough on the task at hand. I'm not sure that's the best solution, but you probably get the idea. So the last point I wanted to make in this lecture was the experiential part. And the quote in the lecture, and depending on how you print them out and how big the type font is, it comes out of different pages. But it's at the end of the section on the reason distortion of withdrawal. What it says is, the most important part of this work is to feel these emotions, to truly experience them. It is impossible to get rid of this life-prohibiting, idealized self-image if you merely look on and observe in a detached way with your intellect what is in you. You have to become acutely aware of all these often contradictory trends, and this will be painful. There's a lot of documentaries and films that I collect, and I use them for teaching, but perhaps the truth is I use them for me, and they imbue themselves into me, and I wind up being able to more clearly delineate or talk about a concept because I have a clearer point of view. And one of the documentaries I've got is called A Life Without Pain. And it's a documentary about a disease. A particular child is featured in the documentary. But it's a documentary about a disease that destroys your ability to feel pain. And this disease is life-threatening. People don't live. Because pain is not the... we're not talking about the... We are talking to some degree, but if you take a hammer and you hit your thumb instead of a nail, that's pain. But every day of your life, there's a little bit of discomfort in your body. And without realizing it, what you do is you shift your position, or you go to the toilet, or you eat, or you cough, or you sneeze, or you stretch your muscles, or. There's 1,000 things you do without even being aware or conscious of it. And these are all reactions to tiny discomforts in the body because the organic system must continue to be fluid. Stasis in an organism equals death. And so when this disease removes the capacity to receive feedback in the form of pain, people die because their bowels don't work, because they don't realize they're running out of oxygen, because they sit kitty corner on their leg, cut off the circulation, and parts of their body die. When they become ill or diseased, the body doesn't know how to react because pain is the signal that starts a lot of physiological processes. So the reason I'm bringing this up is when the guide says you have to become acutely aware of all these contradictory trends and this will be painful. We think in terms of hitting our thumb with a hammer, but the guide is talking about a spiritual level of pain where we are disturbed. We feel discomfort. We feel disquiet. And without that sense of pain, we would not get up on our feet and do something about it. We wouldn't. Just like human beings who don't feel pain do not move their limbs so that they are more comfortable and restore the blood circulation. That's why I'm going to go off on a tiny tangent here because I'm a body person. That's why people who have diabetes lose their limbs and have to have their legs amputated, because diabetes kills the nerve ends in the extremities, and eventually the body doesn't work properly. And when the body doesn't work properly in an extremity, that extremity becomes I think the word is gangrenous. Anyway, it gets gangrene. It begins to rot. And once that sets in, the only thing they can do is lop it off. Spiritually, there's some truth to that. If we have an area of us that becomes painful and we don't deal with it, it will grow. And it will affect our lives. So, yes, it may be painful to see that you're not all you hoped to be. But the deeper message in the guide lectures is you are a child of God. You are a divine being. You are beautiful the way you are. That you're here on this planet because you want to be better. You want to undergo some more transformation. And you've come to this planet and agreed to be this crazy being called a human being. Because we have such tremendous capacity to access soul distortions and transform them and purify. So that's all I have to say about the lecture. If there's any questions, I'm happy to respond to them. My goodness. It's a great lecture. Yeah.
One thought that I have, Jen, that this is Leah.
Mm-hmm.
That one component that sits in the foundation of each distortion is fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to mention that is helpful in seeking those places in the self.
Yes.
And I'm sure you made the connection in other lectures, and I'm here for the first time, but that place, and it was very apparent in a few of the examples he brought, the place where the inner translation goes to life or death and to fear is the place where we contract and we go into the distortion of whatever attribute it is that would save us, quote unquote.
Yeah. No, that's very true. So the game I play is being somewhat prideful and willful. Oh my God, I forgot to say that, and Leah had to remind me. And what I do with myself is say, why not? Because your voice and the way you express it could say it in a way that somebody could hear it more clearly. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. Anyone else want to say anything, or shall we consider this done? Going once. Going, going twice. But it's been an hour and a half. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for joining me. And I hope, you know, that you'll find value in them and enjoy another one soon. So thanks everybody for participating.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan.
Aha. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Be still.